The evening of January 18th, 1965, was bitterly cold in Harlem, with temperatures dropping to 14 degrees Fahrenheit and a harsh wind making the air feel even colder. By 7 o'clock, as darkness settled over the neighborhood, most residents had retreated indoors to apartments heated by radiators that hissed and clanked, but that provided essential warmth against the winter night. The streets were largely empty, except for people hurrying between buildings, bundled in heavy coats and scarves against the cold. Robert Williams was 32 years old, someone who had worked as a maintenance worker at various buildings in Harlem until losing his job 3 months earlier when the company he worked for went bankrupt. Williams lived with his wife Dorothy, who was 29, and their two children, Michael, who was 6, and Sarah, who was 4. The Williams family had been evicted from their apartment 2 weeks earlier after falling behind on rent during the months Robert had been unemployed. Since the eviction, the family had been staying temporarily with Dorothy's sister in a small apartment that was already crowded with the sister's own family. On January 18th, Dorothy's sister informed Robert and Dorothy that they could no longer stay because the landlord had complained about the overcrowding and had threatened eviction if the additional occupants did not leave. Robert and Dorothy understood that they could not endanger Dorothy's sister's housing situation, so they gathered their few belongings and their 2 children and left the apartment at approximately 5 o'clock that afternoon. Robert had been trying to find housing for his family during the 2 weeks since their eviction, but every apartment he inquired about required first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit, typically totaling more than $300, which Robert did not have. Robert had found temporary work doing day labor jobs that paid a few dollars per day, but this income was insufficient to save the amount needed for an apartment while also paying for food and other necessities for his family. As evening approached on January 18th and temperatures continued dropping, Robert recognized that his family needed shelter for the night. Robert remembered hearing about an emergency shelter operated by a church on West 141st Street that provided temporary housing for homeless families. Robert led his family to the church. Arriving at approximately 6:30 in the evening, the church shelter was located in the building's basement, accessed through a side entrance where a line of approximately 20 people were waiting in the cold. Robert joined the line with Dorothy and their children, standing in the frigid air while the line slowly advanced. Michael and Sarah were both shivering despite being wrapped in blankets, and Dorothy held Sarah close, trying to keep her warm. After waiting for approximately 40 minutes, Robert reached the entrance where a man who appeared to be approximately 50 years old was managing admissions to the shelter. Robert explained that his family needed shelter for the night and that his children were very cold. The man, whose name was Thomas Henderson, and looked at Robert and his family and stated that the shelter was full and could not accommodate any additional people that night. Robert asked whether there was any space at all, emphasizing that his children were only 6 and 4 years old and that the temperature was dangerously cold. Henderson stated again that the shelter was full and added that many families needed shelter and that Robert's family was no more deserving than others who had been turned away. Henderson's tone conveyed not just that space was unavailable, but that Robert was being presumptuous to expect accommodation. A woman who was standing near the entrance waiting to be admitted to the shelter made a comment loud enough for Robert and others in line to hear, stating that some people needed to learn to manage their money better instead of expecting churches to solve their problems. Several other people waiting in line nodded in agreement or made similar comments, suggesting that Robert must have made poor decisions to end up in his current situation with young children. Robert felt humiliation as people around him discussed his failings while his children stood shivering in the cold. Robert did not respond to the comments or argue with Henderson about the shelter's capacity. Robert simply took Dorothy's arm and led his family away from the church, walking back toward the street, while people in line watched them leave. Robert and Dorothy walked with their children for several blocks, trying to think of where they could go. The temperature continued dropping as night deepened, and both children were crying from the cold. Robert tried several other churches that he knew operated in Harlem, but found either that they did not have shelter programs or that their shelters were also full. By 9 o'clock, Robert had exhausted his knowledge of where homeless families could find shelter. Robert and Dorothy discussed what to do, speaking quietly while their children huddled together under blankets. Dorothy suggested that perhaps they could spend the night in the subway station, where at least they would be out of the wind. Robert was reluctant because subway stations were dangerous at night, and because transit police often forced homeless people to leave the stations. But Robert could not think of better alternatives. The Williams family descended into the subway station at 135th Street and Lenox Avenue at approximately 9:30. The station was warmer than the street, but still cold, and the concrete platform and tile walls provided no comfort. Robert found a section of the platform that was relatively sheltered and laid out the blankets his family had brought. Dorothy sat on the blankets with Michael and Sarah pressed against her, while Robert sat nearby, trying to shield them from the wind that blew through the tunnel when trains passed. At approximately 10:15, a man who was walking through the subway station stopped when he saw the Williams family sitting on the platform. This man was Marcus Jenkins, who was 43 years old and who worked as an associate in Bumpy Johnson's organization. Jenkins asked Robert whether the family had a place to stay, and Robert explained quietly that they had been evicted and had been unable to find shelter. Jenkins stated that the subway station was not safe for a family with young children and that the transit police would likely force them to leave within hours. Jenkins asked Robert for his name and for information about how long the family had been homeless and what had led to their situation. Robert explained about losing his job, falling behind on rent, being evicted, and then being turned away from the church shelter that evening. Jenkins stated that he might be able to help, but that Robert should wait at the station while Jenkins made some inquiries. Jenkins left the station and went to a restaurant on Lenox Avenue, where he made a phone call to Samuel Foster, who was one of Johnson's closest associates. Jenkins explained what he had observed in the subway station and provided the information Robert had shared about his family's situation. Foster stated that he would relay the information to Johnson and would contact Jenkins with instructions. Foster went to Johnson's apartment and explained what Jenkins had reported. Johnson was 59 years old at this time, someone who had returned to Harlem after serving time in federal prison and who was managing various operations while also dealing with health problems that would contribute to his death 3 years later. Johnson listened to Foster's account without visible reaction, then asked specific questions about the Williams family's situation and about what had happened at the church shelter. Johnson was troubled by the account. Not just because one family was sleeping in a subway station, but because the situation represented broader systemic problems that Johnson recognized affected many Harlem residents. Johnson understood that housing insecurity in Harlem was reaching crisis levels during the mid-1960s. Urban renewal projects were demolishing old buildings and displacing residents. Rents were increasing as landlords recognized they could charge higher prices. Employment opportunities remained limited for black workers who faced discrimination in hiring. Many families were one missed paycheck away from eviction, and resources for homeless families were grossly inadequate. The church shelter that had turned away the Williams family had capacity for perhaps 30 people, but hundreds of families needed emergency housing on any given night. And Johnson recognized that responding to the Williams family's immediate need was necessary but insufficient. Simply giving them an apartment would help one family while hundreds of others remained in crisis. What was needed was a systematic response that would address housing insecurity more comprehensively by creating emergency housing capacity, by establishing a fund to help families pay deposits for permanent housing, by coordinating among landlords who owned buildings to ensure apartments were available for families in crisis, and by creating structures that would prevent families from reaching the point of homelessness. Johnson spent the late evening of January 18th developing a comprehensive strategy. Johnson instructed Foster to take immediate action to house the Williams family that night, while Johnson began organizing a broader response that would operate over subsequent weeks and months. Foster returned to the subway station at approximately 11:30 that evening and told Robert that arrangements had been made for his family to stay in an apartment temporarily. Foster drove the Williams family to a building on West 145th Street where a vacant apartment on the third floor was available. The apartment was small, 2 rooms plus a kitchen and bathroom, but it was warm and clean. Foster explained that the family could stay there while more permanent arrangements were made. The apartment was unfurnished, and the Williams family had no furniture beyond the few belongings they had carried with them. Foster made phone calls to several people who operated second-hand furniture businesses or who stored furniture from estates of people who had died. Within 2 hours, several men arrived at the apartment with furniture including 2 beds, a table with chairs, a couch, and basic kitchen items. By 2 o'clock in the morning on January 19th, the Williams family had a furnished apartment where they could sleep safely. While Foster was addressing the Williams family's immediate needs, Johnson was organizing a broader response. Johnson spent January 19th and the following days building a coalition that would address housing insecurity systematically. Johnson enlisted 9 key figures who would each contribute specific resources or expertise. Thomas Chen owned multiple residential buildings in Harlem and agreed to designate 5 apartments across his properties as emergency housing that could be made available within 24 hours to families in crisis. Eleanor Washington directed social services at St. Martin's Episcopal Church and agreed to coordinate intake procedures for identifying families who needed emergency housing. William Morrison managed relationships with several other landlords and agreed to recruit additional property owners to participate in providing emergency apartments. David Richardson ran a furniture storage business and agreed to provide furnishing for emergency apartments at cost. Patricia Henderson worked with the Harlem Tenants Association and agreed to help families navigate the process of securing permanent housing. Raymond Carter managed a small loan fund and agreed to expand it to provide no-interest loans for families who needed money for deposits and first month's rent. Dorothy Chen was a social worker who agreed to help families address underlying issues like unemployment or eviction proceedings. Marcus Hendricks operated a moving company and agreed to provide transportation services for families moving into emergency or permanent housing. Robert Foster, a minister at Abyssinian Baptist Church, agreed to mobilize church congregations to donate furniture, clothing, and household items. This coalition represented resources across multiple domains: real estate, social services, finance, labor, community organizing, and religious institutions. Each person brought specific capabilities that would be necessary for a comprehensive response to housing insecurity. Johnson's strategy involved multiple coordinated components. The first component was establishing emergency housing capacity. Chen's 5 apartments would be kept vacant and available for families who needed immediate shelter. When Foster or Washington identified a family in crisis, that family could be moved into emergency housing within hours rather than being forced to sleep on streets or in subway stations. These emergency apartments would be furnished through Richardson's business and through donations coordinated by Robert Foster's church network. Families could stay in emergency housing for up to 90 days while more permanent arrangements were made. The second component was creating a rapid response fund to help families pay deposits for permanent housing. Many families like the Williams had been evicted but could afford ongoing rent if they could overcome the barrier of first month, last month, and security deposit totaling several $100s. Carter's loan fund would provide this money as no-interest loans that families could repay over 12 months. This would allow families to move directly from emergency housing to permanent housing without having to save money while paying for temporary shelter. The third component was coordination with landlords to ensure apartments were available. Morrison would maintain relationships with property owners throughout Harlem and would know which buildings had vacancies. When families were ready to move from emergency housing to permanent apartments, Morrison would connect them with landlords who had suitable available units. This coordination would prevent families from spending weeks searching for apartments while living in temporary situations. The fourth component was addressing underlying causes of housing insecurity. Dorothy Chen would work with families to address unemployment by connecting them with job opportunities, to resolve eviction proceedings when possible, to access public benefits they might be eligible for, and to address other issues that had contributed to their housing crisis. This support would increase the likelihood that families would maintain stable housing after moving into permanent apartments. The fifth component was sustainable funding. Ed Johnson initially funded the program with $25,000 from his own resources, which would cover emergency housing costs, furnishing, moving expenses, and loans for deposits for approximately 50 families. But Johnson recognized that sustainable operations would require ongoing funding. Johnson coordinated with multiple individuals and businesses in Harlem to contribute to the housing fund, creating a pool of resources that would support operations for years. These components began operating in late January 1965. Chen's emergency apartments were prepared and furnished. Washington established intake procedures at her church. Carter expanded his loan fund. Morrison began coordinating with landlords. Dorothy Chen prepared to provide social services. Hendricks made his moving company available. Robert Foster organized donations through his church. The first test of the system came on January 25th, 1 week after the Williams family had been housed. Washington received information about another family that was facing imminent eviction and had nowhere to go. Within 12 hours, this family was moved into one of Chen's emergency apartments, furnished with items from Richardson's business and church donations, and enrolled in Dorothy Chen's support program. Within 6 weeks, the family had secured employment, obtained a loan for apartment deposit, moved into permanent housing, and begun repaying the loan. The rapid, effective response to this second family demonstrated that the system Johnson had organized was operational. Word began spreading through Harlem's community networks that families facing housing crises could seek help through St. Martin's Episcopal Church, where Washington would coordinate emergency assistance. The availability of this help created confidence among Harlem residents that homelessness was not inevitable even when families faced financial crises. During the first 6 months of 1965, the housing program assisted 47 families. Each family received emergency housing within 24 hours of being identified as in crisis. Families stayed in emergency housing for an average of 42 days while working with Dorothy Chen to address employment and other issues, and while securing deposits for permanent apartments through Carter's loan fund. 39 of the 47 families successfully moved into permanent housing and remained stably housed 6 months later, an 83% success rate that was remarkable given that most of these families had been on the verge of sleeping on streets. The Williams family, the first family assisted through the program, moved from the emergency apartment on West 145th Street into a permanent apartment in March 1965 after Robert secured employment as a building superintendent. The Williams family received a loan for the apartment deposit and repaid it over 12 months. Robert and Dorothy remained in that apartment for more than a decade, raising their children in stable housing. The success of the housing program created effects beyond helping individual families. The demonstration that emergency housing could be provided quickly and effectively when resources were coordinated systematically influenced how community organizations thought about addressing homelessness. Prior to the program, homeless families had few options beyond church shelters that were chronically overcrowded and that provided only overnight accommodation without addressing underlying causes of housing insecurity. The program demonstrated that comprehensive support, including emergency housing, financial assistance, social services, and coordination with landlords could help families transition from crisis to stability. The program also created precedent about shared responsibility for addressing housing insecurity. Chen's provision of emergency apartments established that landlords who profited from Harlem's housing market bore some responsibility for ensuring that housing was available to families in crisis. Carter's loan fund demonstrated that providing capital to overcome temporary financial barriers was more effective than expecting families to save money while homeless. Dorothy Chen's social services showed that addressing unemployment and other underlying issues increased the likelihood of sustained housing stability. The coordination among multiple sectors—real estate, social services, finance, religious institutions, labor—illustrated that complex community problems required coordinated responses rather than isolated efforts by single organizations. The program's success demonstrated that such coordination was possible when someone with authority and resources took responsibility for organizing it. The program continued operating after Johnson's death in July 1968. Sustained by the coalition he had assembled and by ongoing contributions from individuals and businesses who had been recruited to support it. The housing fund that Johnson had initially funded with $25,000 grew to more than $100,000 by 1970 through contributions from multiple sources. The emergency apartments Chen had designated expanded to include units in additional buildings owned by other landlords who joined the program. By 1970, the program had assisted more than 200 families, maintaining approximately the same 80 to 85% success rate in transitioning families from emergency housing to permanent stable housing. The program became known in Harlem simply as the Housing Project, and residents understood that families facing eviction or homelessness could seek help through St. Martin's Episcopal Church. The quiet effectiveness of how the program operated, families identified in crisis received emergency housing within hours. Comprehensive support helped address underlying issues. Coordination with landlords ensured permanent housing was available. Financial assistance overcame barriers to securing apartments. Sustained support increased likelihood of long-term stability, illustrated principles that characterized Johnson's most effective interventions. At the story of how the Williams family had been turned away from a church shelter on a freezing January night, and had been given an apartment and furniture that same night, became one of many narratives that circulated in Harlem about Johnson's philanthropy. The story emphasized the immediacy of the response. The family had been sleeping in a subway station at 10 o'clock and was sleeping in a furnished apartment by 2 in the morning, and the generosity of providing not just temporary shelter, but a fully furnished home. But the more significant legacy was the systematic program that the Williams family's situation had catalyzed. The immediate charitable act of housing one family had revealed the inadequacy of existing responses to housing insecurity and had prompted Johnson to organize a sustainable program that would help hundreds of families over subsequent years. The Williams family never learned the full extent of what had been organized in response to their situation. Robert and Dorothy knew that someone had provided them with emergency housing and furniture, and they were grateful for that assistance. But they did not know about the coalition that had been assembled, the emergency housing capacity that had been established, the loan fund that had been created, or the social services program that had been developed. They knew only that they had received help when they desperately needed it, and that this help had enabled them to rebuild stable lives for themselves and their children. For Johnson, the housing program represented one of many ways he exercised authority and accepted responsibility for community welfare. The program required minimal involvement from Johnson after the initial organization. The coalition he had assembled operated the program, and Johnson's role was primarily ensuring adequate funding and occasionally resolving problems that required his authority to address. The program's success required no constant attention or management from Johnson. It simply worked because Johnson had organized it properly and had recruited the right people with the right resources. The program's legacy extended beyond the specific families it assisted. The demonstration that homelessness could be addressed through coordinated community response influenced how social service organizations throughout Harlem thought about their work. On the precedent that landlords bore responsibility for providing emergency housing influenced how property owners understood their obligations to the community. The success of the program in transitioning families from crisis to stability provided evidence that housing insecurity was solvable with adequate resources and coordination. When Johnson died in July 1968, the housing program was mentioned prominently in discussions of his legacy. People noted that while Johnson was known for various illegal activities and for violence when necessary, he was also known for helping families avoid homelessness, for ensuring that children had stable housing, and for organizing systematic responses to community problems rather than simply providing isolated acts of charity. The program continued operating for decades after Johnson's death, evolving as Harlem's housing situation changed, but maintaining its core function of providing emergency housing and support to families in crisis. By the 1980s, the program had assisted more than 1,000 families, and many of these families, including the Williams family, remained stably housed years after receiving initial assistance. The quiet power of the program, documented, systematic, effective, sustainable, stood in contrast to dramatic narratives about criminal figures. There were no theatrical displays, no spectacles designed to generate attention or admiration. There was only careful organization, strategic coordination, sustained effort, and demonstrated capability to address a fundamental human need for shelter and dignity. This was the reality of how authority operated when wielded by people who understood that community problems required systematic solutions, that sustainable change required coordination across multiple sectors, and that real power was measured not by dramatic gestures, but by lasting transformations in how communities functioned and how vulnerable people were treated.